I am your host, Nero Wolfe, and tonight we enter yet another tale of secrecy and suspense.
Chapter 1. The Widow's Question. The widow, Mrs. Helen Rudd, came to the brownstone with a frightened steadiness that made me trust her at once, and Wolfe not at all. She was one of those women who had crossed over from good looks into distinction without stopping to complain on the way. Her face was narrow, controlled, and pale in the manner of someone who had not slept enough for several weeks, and her clothes had the plain excellence that means money used with sense instead of vanity. She gave me her card in the hall, and while I was taking her coat, she looked around as if the house might answer a question before she reached the office. It did not. The office was as it always is when a stranger enters and expects something to happen at once. The big desk planted like a commandment, the red leather chair with Wolfe in it, occupying more cubic space than seemed lawful, the yellow glow from the lamps, the shelves of books that had all earned their keep, and the globe that has never helped solve a case, but continues to behave as if it had. Wolfe had finished beer, and was in the interval between one activity he approved of, and another he approved of more. Mrs. Rudd sat where I placed her, and folded her hands so firmly I thought the fingers might leave marks in each other. "My name," she said, "is Helen Rudd. I was told that if there is a thing which appears absurd, but is not absurd, you are the man to consult." Wolfe grunted. "I am often consulted by people unable to distinguish between the two," I said. "That means go ahead." She turned her eyes to me for half a second, grateful because I had translated from Wolfe into English. "My husband died 11 months ago," she said. "Since then I have remained in our house on East 61st Street. There is no one else living there except a maid who has been with me for years. 3 weeks ago I noticed that the brass hinges on an old cedar chest in my bedroom were wet each morning, not damp in a general way. Wet by 7 o'clock, there are small beads on them. By 9 they have nearly vanished." Wolfe opened his eyes a trifle wider. "Only the hinges?" "Yes." "No other metal?" "Number, no dampness on the wood." "None." "No leak in ceiling or wall?" "None." "No window left open?" "Number." I got out my notebook because when Wolfe begins firing questions like that, the answer to one of them usually matters later, and I prefer not to trust memory when memory can be outbid by ink. Mrs. Rudd continued. "At first I thought it was some defect in the metal, though that would not explain why it began only recently. Then I touched it and smelled my fingers. It was not oil. It was not the smell of tarnish. It was salt," I said. She turned to me. "Yes, or something like it." "Seawater," I said. She gave a quick nod. "That is what I thought, though it seemed insane." Wolfe shut his eyes completely. "A thing damp at sunrise," he murmured, "has usually had company in darkness." That pleased her less than it pleased him. "Most of his remarks do," I asked. "Who else knows about this?" "My maid, no one else." "Doctor?" Wolfe asked. She looked startled. "Number. You should consult one. Olfactory fantasies are possible." A flush rose under her skin. "I brought a handkerchief this morning and rubbed the moisture from the hinge onto it. I sealed it in an envelope. You may smell it yourself." She took the envelope from her bag and handed it across to me. I gave it to Wolfe, who regarded it as though it might contain a bill. He opened it with care, unfolded the handkerchief, and sniffed. Then he handed it to me without comment. I sniffed too. It was seawater. Not suggestion, not fancy, not a poetic resemblance. I had spent enough hours on waterfront piers in weather, fit only for fish to know the smell of tide. "Well," I said, "there's your doctor." Wolfe put the handkerchief back into the envelope, described the chest. "It belonged to my husband's grandmother, cedar, of course. About 4 feet long with brass hinges and a brass escutcheon. It stands at the foot of my bed." "Locked?" "Yes." "Who has the key?" "I do." "Has the lock been tampered with?" "Number, what is in it?" She hesitated, and I saw Wolfe notice the hesitation and file it in a drawer with a label on it. "Blankets," she said. "Old shawls, household linens, a packet of letters tied with ribbon." "From whom to whom?" Wolfe asked at once. "My husband's father to his mother, very old, of no importance." Wolfe made a small noise through his nose. The one that means he has just heard a statement he does not intend to accept until it is beaten into shape. I asked, any servants before this started? Repairmen, guests, relatives, spiritual advisors, men wanting to sell encyclopedias. No guests, no relatives. There was a carpenter in the room about a month ago to mend a shutter catch. Also, the furnace man had gone through the house for the autumn inspection. Names, she supplied them. I wrote them down, Wolfe said. Your husband's death, cause, heart failure. Sudden. Yes, expected. She looked at him with controlled dislike. He had not been well. Did his death profit anyone? I admired the way she kept her hands still. Mr. Wolfe, do all your questions presume indecency? All human transactions do. My husband left me the house and most of his property. 2 smaller bequests went to a cousin and to a charitable institution. There was no dispute. Insurance? Yes. Amount, she told him. Eno, Wolfe said, to promote curiosity. She straightened in the chair. Do you mean to imply that my husband was murdered because my hinges are wet? Number, I imply nothing. I note that events are commonly connected when people are eager to disconnect them. That was Wolfe in a sentence. He could insult a witness, propose a theory, and congratulate himself on logic without moving more than his lips. I stepped in before she got up and walked out, which would have been a pity since I had begun to enjoy the case. Mrs. Rudd, did your husband have enemies? He was a lawyer. That answers the question too well. Did he have any enemies who might enter your house after midnight and sprinkle Atlantic Ocean on old furniture? Her mouth almost smiled. Not that I know of. Did he travel? Yes, years ago, before our marriage. He was fond of ships and ports and coastal towns. He kept maps. Kept, Wolfe said. She turned to him. His study was rearranged after his death. By whom? By me. Were any papers destroyed? Some. Without inspection. Mr. Wolfe. Madam, when someone comes to me with seawater on brass hinges in a locked bedroom, I do not consent to be led about with a ribbon. There was silence for 3 seconds. I counted, because that is often how long people need to decide whether to be offended or truthful. She chose truthful, or a version of it. There was one packet, she said. Only one. My husband had kept old notes from a business matter many years ago. He had once told me it had been an ugly affair and best forgotten. After his death, I burned them unread. Wolfe's eyes opened. Parfois. Yes, she said sharply. Perhaps it was foolish. I am telling you the truth now. Did the Wet Hinges begin before or after that burning? After, about 10 days after. Wolfe looked at me. Archie. That meant the conference was over and work had begun. I nodded and turned back to her. We'll need to see the room, the chest, the household, and anyone with keys or access. Also the carpenter, the furnace man, and the maid. You can leave the address, your telephone number, and a check. Wolfe likes all 3. Not in that order. She took out her checkbook, and while she wrote, I watched her face. She was scared, yes, but not merely of a trick or nuisance. She was afraid of what a solved answer might reach back and touch. A woman whose brass hinges are mysteriously wet at dawn does not come to near a Wolfe, unless something has already started moving in her mind, and minds are usually moved by memory before they are moved by evidence. When she had gone, carrying a little less composure than she brought, I stood by the desk and looked at Wolfe. Well, he made a face at the universe. There are too many possibilities. That has never discouraged you before. It discourages me now. Moisture may be carried, condensed, exuded, transferred, or contrived. Salt may indicate seawater, sweat, chemicals, or theater. But there is one charming point. The packet she burned. That also. Number the chest is at the foot of the bed. Therefore the drama, whatever it is, has been staged for her, not concealed from her. Someone wishes the phenomenon observed. I sat down. To frighten her, perhaps, or to remind her, or to compel a question she has not yet asked. I looked at my notes. The widow's question. he grunted, which in his case can mean agreement, impatience, or an adjustment of internal machinery. At that moment, Fritz came to the door to announce lunch, and Wolfe rose, not briskly, but with the inevitability of weather. A client may arrive with terror, deception, or blood on her gloves. But if lunch is ready, lunch gets right of way. He moved out, and I followed him to the dining room, because while deduction may sustain the soul, it takes something else to sustain the detective. During the meal, Wolfe said nothing about seawater, widows, dead lawyers, or burnt papers. He discussed a guinea hen with reverence and rejected a sauce with sorrow. That is his way. He can leave a problem untouched for an hour and come back to it with a tooth in it. At 3:30, after he had gone to the plant rooms and returned placated by the orchids, I got my hat and notebook. "I'm going," I said. "Obviously, to East 61st Street. Less obvious, but acceptable. Examine everything, smell everything. Do not flirt with the widow." I never flirt on duty unless it advances the cause of justice. It usually advances only your vanity. I went out grinning, because that is better than going out solemn, and because with a Nero Wolfe case, the opening move is often the only simple one. By nightfall, I expected to know whether the seawater on the hinges came from a human hand, a mechanical trick, or a ghost with maritime habits. I was wrong on all three. Chapter 2. The house by the river, Mrs. Rudd had said East 61st Street in Wolfe's office, and perhaps once that had been exact enough, but the place she took me to that afternoon stood farther east than the city usually likes to admit, where stone and brick begin to remember weather and water, and a man can smell tide under motor oil. The street ended in a narrow private lane, and the lane ended at iron gates with a view beyond them that was almost indecent in Manhattan, a stretch of black river, a low stone wall, a patch of winter grass, and a boathouse crouched over the water like a secret with shingles. I drove because Mrs. Rudd had come in her own car, and then, after a glance at me and one at the sky, had said she preferred not to arrive alone, since I am occasionally susceptible to a voice that asks for protection without overworking the word. I told her to get in. She sat beside me with the composed rigidity of a woman who had made up her mind not to be afraid while remaining thoroughly unconvinced. The house itself was narrow in front and deep in back, 3 stories of old brown stone altered by money into quiet comfort. Not grand. Money with self-respect seldom is. The entrance hall had black and white marble squares worn at the center, and the air held a mixture of beeswax, cedar, coal dust from some earlier decade, and the faint river smell that belongs to docks and pilings and things tied up in weather. A maid admitted us, a compact woman of 50 or so, with the hard look that service acquires after long success. This was Nora Pike, who had been with Mrs. Rudd for 13 years and had probably formed low opinions of a great many employers while continuing to save them from themselves. Mrs. Rudd said, "Nora, this is Mr. Goodwin." Nora gave me a glance that said if I was from the police I was too well dressed, and if I was from somewhere else it was probably worse. "How do you do?" "I do all right," I said. "You've seen the Wet Hinges?" "Yes, sir. You smelled them?" "Yes. Like seawater." She hesitated just enough to show intelligence. "Like the river, but cleaner." That was a neat distinction, and I put it away. Mrs. Rudd led me upstairs to the bedroom. It was a long room with 2 tall windows facing west toward the street, and a pair of narrower ones at the back giving on the river. The bed was old mahogany. The rugs were Persian. The dressing table had no powder explosion on it, no clutter, no sentimental snapshots, and no signs of a woman careless enough to mislay either objects or facts. At the foot of the bed stood the cedar chest, long and low and dark from age, with brass hinges at the back and a brass escutcheon in front. Quiet inheritance was a fair description. It looked as if generations had used it to store linens and silences. The room itself was dry. I make that plain because dryness was the first thing in it. No sweating window panes, no damp plaster, no chill clinging to corners, no mustiness under the furniture. A house that backs onto water usually advertises the circumstance somewhere, but this room denied it. Then I put my fingers on the hinges, cold beaded, not a film, not a tarnished ooze, but formed moisture, clear and separate, like perspiration on a glass. I put my fingertip to one bead, lifted it, and sniffed. Same thing as before. Salt, distance, sea. Not the blunt, muddy tang of the East River at low tide, but the cleaner bite of open water carried inland in memory, or in fact. I bent close and examined the brass, the screws, the wood around them, and the back edge of the lid. No tubing, no hidden packing, no fresh tool marks, no darkened patch where someone had lately fixed an apparatus. I put my cheek near the wood. Dry, I got down on one knee, peered under the chest, and then around it. Dry floor, dry rug, dry wall. Mrs. Rudd said quietly, "You see." "Yes," I said. "That's the trouble. I do. Would you like it opened, please?" She produced a key from a ring in her handbag, crossed to the chest and unlocked it. The lid rose without protest. Cedar hit me at once, clean and old. Inside were folded blankets, shawls, table linens, and a flat parcel of letters tied with faded blue ribbon, which she had not mentioned as omitted, but as unimportant. People's notions of what is important are one reason detectives are necessary. "May I asked, indicating the letters. She nodded. They were old. "All right, 40 years at least. Maybe more. I checked only enough to see dates, handwriting, and a domestic tone with no immediate smell of murder. One name, however, stopped my thumb. Captain Ezra Vale. I read the signature twice and then laid the packet back exactly as I had found it. Mrs. Rudd had been watching me. "My husband's father," she said. "Before he became a lawyer, he had been in shipping. Captain. In title more than in command. I believe I never knew him. Any connection with the sea in your husband, too?" "He liked boats, charts, coastlines. He used to say the law was something he did indoors, so he could afford what he loved outdoors." "Did he use the boathouse?" "Yes, not often in recent years." "Who uses it now?" "No one regularly." That was one of those answers which, because it tries to sound complete, tells you it isn't. I closed the lid and bent again to the hinges. They were on the river side of the chest. If the chest had a river side, that is, the back windows stood in line with them, at a distance of 12 feet or so. I went to the windows. Both were latched. The frames were snug, no drafts. A person could not stand outside them without using a ladder or wings, and I had not yet encountered either in a homicide inquiry. "Did your husband ever keep anything else in the chest?" I asked. "I don't know. You live in a house with a river at the back and a boathouse over the water. And you don't know what your husband kept in the chest at the foot of your bed." She met that without blinking. "I married him, Mr. Goodwin. I did not inventory him. That was good enough to deserve respect, so I gave it some." He asked to see the back of the house, and she took me downstairs through a sitting room and a narrow library into a glazed rear corridor. Beyond it was a stone terrace, winter, bare climbing vines, and below, a path to the boathouse. The river beyond was dark and full of bad intentions. The boathouse sat on piles and timbers, low over the water, its roof sagging only enough to look authentic, not enough to be unsafe. One small lamp burned inside, yellow and lonely. We went down. The boards of the path were damp, but the air had sharpened, and there was nothing in it to explain seawater in an upstairs brass hinge. The boathouse door stuck an inch, then yielded. Inside were 2 empty slips, 1 skiff-on blocks, coils of rope, boat hooks, a bench, shelves with paint cans and tools, and a smell of tar, wet wood, and old gasoline. Through the gaps between the pilings, you could hear the black slap of water underneath. I moved around slowly, looking not for drama but for use. A place that is genuinely neglected acquires one kind of disorder. A place visited secretly acquires another. On the bench was a lantern with soot on the top and fresh oil in it. On one shelf, a box of matches had been opened recently. In a corner stood a pair of rubber boots, one with a newer sole than the other. On a nail hung a dark overcoat which did not belong to a woman, Mrs. Rudd said. That is Daniel's, I think. Your son-in-law. Yes, lives here. My daughter died 4 years ago. Daniel kept close to the family afterward. Lately he has helped with certain financial matters. Meaning? With the accounts, with leases, with securities. My husband had formerly handled everything. Is Daniel Cross competent? Yes, honest. She looked at the river before answering. I have believed so, past tense. I don't know what I believe this week. That was better than many witnesses do. Most of them prefer certainty to thought. I examined the coat. Good cloth, modestly expensive, city cut. In one pocket I found nothing. In another, a leather glove and a folded dock receipt from 3 nights earlier, for 2 hours mooring at Pier 91. Interesting, because men do not generally pay mooring fees for empty hands. I showed the receipt to Mrs. Rudd. Have you seen this before? Number. Does Mr. Cross own a boat? Not to my knowledge. Has your husband left one? There was a launch, years ago, sold. I put the receipt in my notebook, not because I meant to steal it, but because I meant to ask Daniel Cross about it before anyone had time to remember an innocent explanation. We went back to the house, and in the library I met him. He was 38 or 9, medium tall, well kept, with the handsome fatigue that some men cultivate without help from nature. His hair was dark and disciplined. His clothes fit too well for neglect, and not well enough for vanity. He had grey eyes that examined the room before they settled on a face. If you told me in advance that he managed money for other people, I would have believed it. If you told me he lied carefully, I would have believed that too, Mrs. Rudd said. Daniel, this is Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Wolfe has asked him to inquire into the matter I mentioned. He gave me his hand. Good grip, measured pressure. The hinges, that's the word for them, I said. He smiled politely, which is one of the less useful varieties. I hope you won't think us absurd. I passed absurd half an hour ago and kept going. He laughed a little. Not much. Can I help? You can begin by telling me how often you walk to the docks alone in the evening. The smile stayed for a fraction too long. Do I? Your coat is in the boathouse. I had forgotten it there, and the dock receipt in the pocket. That stopped the smile. He turned to Mrs. Rudd, not to me. You went through my things. I did, I said. Detectives are vulgar that way. He faced me. It proves nothing. I agree. That's why I asked, instead of arresting you. He moved one shoulder. I sometimes go down to the commercial docks to meet a man who handles marine investments. Since Mr. Rudd's death, I have been looking into certain holdings the family possesses. Barges, warehouse shares, transport paper. Water gets into everything around New York eventually, including finance. That sounds composed in advance, I said. It also happens to be true. Mrs. Rudd spoke, and there was ice in it. Daniel has taken charge of our accounts because someone had to. The matter is practical. Good, I said. Practical matters leave records. He gave me a sharp look. Do you suspect me of moistening brass hinges before dawn? Number, I suspect everyone of something. The trick is to decide what. Nora came in then with tea. The timing was so good I nearly applauded. Old houses often acquire servants who know exactly when conversation needs a tray set down in the middle of it. She poured for us with the solemnity of a priestess, and heard every word thereafter while appearing to hear none. I took my cup and asked her, Who sleeps in this house besides Mrs. Rudd? Myself in the back room off the kitchen. Sir, Mr. Hall on the 3rd floor, when he is in residence. Who is Mr. Hall? Mrs. Rudd's nephew, said Helen, my sister's son. He has rooms here while attending Columbia, though he is away as often as he is present. How old? 20? 2. And recently present. Nora answered. He was here 2 nights ago, sir. Not last night. Did he ever use the boathouse? As a boy, not of late. Daniel Cross set down his cup. This is becoming a census. That's because houses are full of people, I told him. He looked at me with mild dislike, which was fair. I usually earn it. I spent another 20 minutes with the room, the corridor, the back windows, and the stairs. I checked whether anyone moving from the rear of the house to the bedroom at night would be heard. On the second stair from the landing, there was a soft complaint in the wood. On the fourth, none. The hall runner muted more than it revealed. The bedroom door had an old latch that clicked distinctly on closing. I opened and shut it 3 times. Anyone entering by night would need care, not magic. Before I left, I asked Mrs. Rudd one more question. Has anything else changed in the house since the hinges began to sweat? She thought. Number Nora, behind her, said, Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Rudd turned. What? The river bell at the 23rd Street slip, ma'am. It carries on certain nights with the wind. We have heard it this last week. Helen Rudd frowned. What has that to do with anything? Nora folded her hands. Nothing, perhaps, only you asked if anything had changed. I said, Good for Nora. Details are the small change of truth. Outside, the late afternoon had gone the color of iron. I drove back to the brownstone with the receipt in my pocket, the smell of the boathouse in my clothes, and a pleasant dissatisfaction in my head. It is pleasant because it means the pieces exist, even when they don't yet consent to fit. At the office, I found Wolfe installed behind his desk as if he had never moved from it. Though I knew he had consumed dinner tea, inspected orchids, insulted Theodore, and improved his opinion of the world by sitting still. I gave him the report from the top, omitting nothing. The room dry, the hinges beaded and cold, the old letters signed by Captain Ezra Vale, the boathouse, the coat, the dock receipt, Daniel Cross with the family accounts in his hands and marine interests on his tongue, the nephew on the 3rd floor, the maid in the back, and the river bell heard on certain nights. When I had finished, Wolfe pinched his lower lip between finger and thumb, a habit of his when thought is arranging furniture. The son-in-law, he said, has lately taken charge of the family accounts and spends evenings near docks. Yes, the widow is uneasy but conceals 1 degree more than she reveals. Yes. The old chest may connect with the husband's father, who had maritime associations. Yes. The room is dry as a tax receipt. Wolfe shut his eyes. Then the dampness is more suspicious than any flood stain would have been. I'm glad you approve my weather report. He ignored that. Who else in the house sleeps soundly while the river works? I looked at him. That's all. For the moment, Nora downstairs, if her conscience permits it. The nephew on the 3rd floor, when in residence, Mrs. Rudd in the bedroom, Daniel not in the house, unless he stays late enough to count as a ghost. Why? Wolfe opened his eyes and regarded me with the compassion he reserves for the mentally agile when they are being slow. Because, he said, if an event happens repeatedly in the same room at the same hour, and one occupant observes it only after waking, then another occupant may have the better opportunity to know whether it begins in darkness, at dawn, or before either. Since the river is at the back, and the boathouse is used secretly, I prefer sleepers to theories. I leaned back and considered it. That was Wolfe. I had brought him seawater, accounts, and a suspicious man with dock receipts in his pocket, and he wanted to know who, in the house by the river, slept like a log, while something quiet happened upstairs. The annoying part was that he was probably right. Chapter 3. Death before noon, I had got no farther than the front hall of the brownstone, when the telephone rang with the kind of insistence that always suggests bad news has taken the trouble to be punctual. I picked it up because Fritz was in the kitchen and Wolfe was in the office, pretending to read while actually thinking about the widow, the wet hinges, and whether any of it might interfere with dinner. It was Mrs. Rudd. Her voice was steady in the way a hand is steady when it grips too hard. Mr. Goodwin, please come back, at once. What has happened? A breath, not hesitation, compression. Daniel is dead. I have heard hysteria, confusion, melodrama, and stupidity over telephones, and all of them have their own music. This was none of those. It was shock speaking in a straight line. I'm on my way. I hung up and opened the office door. Wolfe looked up from his book with irritation at being interrupted and curiosity at being interrupted by me, which is the correct order. Archie. Daniel Cross is dead, found by the boathouse. He closed the book without marking the page. That was eloquent. Indeed, Mrs. Rudd wants me there. Go. That was all. Not because he felt nothing, but because when an event becomes a murder, his machinery begins to turn inward, and he economizes language for later use. I got my hat, my notebook, and my car, and headed east. By the time I reached the house on the river, the place had changed its expression. That is something houses do when death enters them. The walls stay the same and the windows don't shift, but proportion alters. The door seems to watch. The hall carries sound differently. Servants move with too much care, and every object looks as if it may shortly be asked a question. There was already a police car outside, and another nosing the curb badly. A uniformed man stood near the rear path with the stiff uncertainty of someone who had arrived before his imagination did. I gave him my name, and he let me pass after the brief inward debate common to policemen who know Wolfe's address. Even if they dislike the connection, Nora Pike met me in the rear corridor. She had gone paler, but that was all. Women of her kind who have kept households running through illness, death notices, and social disasters. Don't flutter. They go wooden until there is time for fluttering later. They are down there, she said, and nodded toward the terrace and the river. Who found him? I did. At what time? A little before noon. Mrs. Rudd had asked me to see whether Mr. Cross would stay for coffee. I went to the boathouse and saw him in the reeds. You touched nothing? No, sir. Anyone else? Not until the police came. Mrs. Rudd? In the library. Lieutenant Rocliffe is with her. That made the afternoon slightly uglier. Rocliffe and I had met often enough to know each other's defects, and mine were better mannered. I went through the library doorway, just long enough to see Helen Rudd sitting straight, backed in a chair near the desk, while Rocliffe stood over a notebook with an expression of civic disappointment. He saw me and turned it into official displeasure. Goodwin, Lieutenant, this is police business. Then I'm relieved. If it were personal, you'd be dangerous. He let that pass because he had a witness in the room, and because when Rocliffe lets a thing pass, it is usually only because he intends to trip over it later and blame someone else. You were here this morning? Yes. Why? Our client had a concern. The hinges. That stopped me half a second. You've heard already. He snorted. Madam has informed me that she hired Wolfe because brass on a cedar chest was wet in the mornings. If that's a joke, it's misplaced. It isn't a joke. I smelled it myself. Salt water. Mrs. Rudd spoke then, quietly. That is true. Rocliffe looked from her to me as if considering whether two lunatics might accidentally agree. Then he said, You can see the body, but you don't touch anything. Afterward you tell me everything Cross said to you this morning. Gladly. I dislike carrying facts longer than necessary. I went out before he could confuse that with cooperation. The wind had come up from the river and was driving low across the path with enough edge to make the boards talk underfoot. The boathouse sat over the black water as it had before, shabby and watchful. But now the reeds beside it had a purpose. Daniel Cross lay half in them, face down with one arm under him and the other twisted near his chest. He had not fallen gracefully. Very few murdered men do. The doctor was there, crouched and detached, his bag open, his interest already moving toward supper. A plainclothes man I knew slightly was standing back from the body, letting his eyes do the work until orders sharpened. I stopped 3 feet away and looked, blunt force to the right temple, enough to crush but not to break the skull open in any dramatic fashion. Blood in the hair and matting at the side of the face. Mud on the knees and one shoulder of the overcoat. His hat was missing. The ground told only a brief story, one hard meeting, one fall, little else. No dragging, no thorough search of the clothes, no robbery. A man does not go into reeds by a boathouse to be killed for his coins. The plainclothes man said, Found maybe 20 minutes ago. Doctor says dead under an hour. The doctor grunted assent without looking up. Cross's pockets still held their shape wallet present. Change present. Keys visible partly out of one pocket. One coin lay on the mud near his left shoe. Either it had bounced free when he fell, or someone had checked him without taking the trouble to restore the scene. His right hand was clenched around something dark. "What's in the fist?" I asked. "A wood splinter," the doctor said. "Fresh broken." I leaned a little, careful not to alter anything. The fragment was perhaps 3 inches long, painted black on one side, raw pale wood on the other, where it had split. Not driftwood, not an old chip from the dock. Fresh, dense grain marine paint, by the look of it. That interested me more than the wound. Wounds tell you violence. Fragments tell you what violence bumped into. I let my eyes travel outward. The boathouse door stood slightly ajar. On the plank threshold was a scuff mark, fresh enough to seem separate from all the old scuffs around it. To the left, one reed was snapped at shoulder height. The river under the piles slapped and muttered. Beyond it the water looked thick and indifferent, like something accustomed to taking secrets downstream in pieces. I crouched to inspect the outer coat pocket, after getting a nod from the plainclothes man. Folded paper. He took it out and handed it to me. A chandlery receipt from upriver, time stamped 9/12 that morning, paid in cash. 1 brass cleat, 6 feet of braided line, 1 small tin of black marine paint, 1 packet of copper tacks. Interesting purchases for a man who, according to the widow, owned no boat. I handed the receipt back. "Not robbed," the plainclothes man said. "Number, you know him." I met him for 10 minutes and disliked how smooth he was. "That's not illegal. Number, it's merely suggestive." I looked from the body to the house. Mrs. Rudd's rear windows were visible above, blank and decorous. Somewhere in that house stood the cedar chest with the wet hinges. Somewhere in it also, by now, was Rowcliffe's curiosity, which would be rougher than mine and less productive. The distance between the bedroom and the reeds wasn't great in feet, but it was considerable in meaning. A widow troubled by seawater in a dry room, a son-in-law in charge of accounts and slipping alone to the docks. Now the same man dead in the marsh with a piece of painted wood in his hand. The river had brought more than weather. Rowcliffe came down the path then, buttoned to the chin and annoyed at the existence of variables. He looked at the body, at me, and at the receipt in the plainclothes man's hand. "Well, what? What do you know about him?" "Very little," he claimed. He was looking after marine investments for the family. He had a coat in the boathouse, and a dock receipt in its pocket from 3 nights ago. He answered questions too smoothly to be innocent of every subject. "Your opinion is wasted on me, facts." That was facts. My opinion was the part about smoothly. He took the chandlery receipt, read it, and frowned. "Cross by this stuff, apparently. Why, that's what makes it a receipt instead of a confession." He did not like that. Good. It kept his blood moving. "You'll give me a statement?" "Certainly." He turned to the doctor. "Weapon." The doctor straightened a little from his crouch. "Blunt object. Could be a club, a mooring bar, a length of timber, anything with weight and a hard edge. 1 solid strike, maybe a second glancing one, but 1 was enough. From behind, mostly from the side. Victim may have turned at the last instant." "Looks like it," I said, "or it broke against him." The doctor shrugged. "Could be." Rowcliffe grunted and sent a man to search the boathouse thoroughly. I used the interval to go back up to the house and speak to Mrs. Rudd before official repetition wore her down into uselessness. She was still in the library, but alone now. Her face had changed since morning. Fear had become something narrower and sharper, a private arithmetic being done under strain. "Did Cross come by appointment?" I asked. Number was he expected. He often came in the late morning. Since taking over the accounts, he had made a habit of it. "You didn't see him arrive?" Number, Nora. She says she heard the back door earlier, but did not look. Anyone else in the house? My nephew Richard Hall returned shortly before 11. He is upstairs. That was news. Did he see Cross? I don't know. Did Cross have enemies? She gave me a strange look. He handled money. Does that count? It always counts. Whether it matters is another thing. Her hands tightened in her lap. "Mr. Goodwin, this is about the chest. Possibly. Number it is. Daniel asked me twice this week whether there were any private papers of my husband's not included in the estate files, and you said no." "Yes." "That was false." "Yes." "What did he suspect?" "I don't know, but he had become inquisitive about my husband's father. That kept me still. Captain Ezra Vale." She nodded. "My husband's father used that name in his shipping affairs." Daniel had found references in old ledgers. He asked whether Vale was a partner. I said I did not know. "Did you?" "Yes." "That honesty helped more than innocence would have. And the papers you burned, memoranda, notes by my husband, transactions, names, dates. I burned them unread except for enough to know they concerned shipping and that name." "Any of it about a boat?" "I don't know." Nora entered then and said, "Lieutenant wants the key to the chest, ma'am." Mrs. Rudd looked at me, I said. "You can refuse, but you'll only lengthen the performance." She handed the key over. I left her and found a telephone in the hall. Wolfe answered on the second ring. "Yes, it has improved," I said. "Cross is dead beside the boathouse. Blunt blow to the temple. Not robbed. One hand clenched around a fresh splinter of black, painted wood. He had a receipt on him from a chandlery for marine hardware and black paint bought this morning." Wolfe was silent. I continued. "Mrs. Rudd admits Cross had been asking about private papers and about Ezra Vale. The nephew is in the house now. Rowcliffe is searching the chest." "The room with the hinges?" "Yes." "Has the dampness ceased to matter?" "Number good. Come home. That's all. Number bring the part of your brain you left by the river." He hung up before leaving. I took one more turn through the rear corridor. On the terrace I met the nephew, Richard Hall, coming in from the stairs. He was 22, narrow, shouldered, intelligent, looking and pale in the way of young men who live irregularly and explain it as intellectual strain. He had a face too open to be trusted immediately and eyes too quick not to notice everything. "Your Hall?" "Yes." "Where were you at 11:30? He blinked. "In my room." "Anion with you?" "Numbered." "Did you see Cross?" "Numbered." "Did you hear anything from the river?" His hesitation was brief but real. "A sound, something striking wood perhaps. I wasn't sure." "Why not say so at once?" He colored. "Because there is already enough horror in the house without my contributing uncertain noises." That was possible. It was also the kind of answer a clever young man gives when deciding on the truth while speaking near it. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, broad and motionless, with the expression he gets when several facts have entered and are still refusing to sit in the proper chairs. I reported everything, from the body in the reeds to Mrs. Rudd's admission about the memoranda, the nephew's doubtful thump, and the chandlery receipt. When I finished, Wolfe pinched his lower lip. "The dead man bought black marine paint tax line and a brass cleat," he said. "Then he was killed beside the boathouse, with a fragment of freshly painted wood in his hand." Yes. And he had recently become interested in Vale, shipping records, and hidden papers. Yes. The widow fears the connection. Yes. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Then murder has not interrupted the previous absurdity. It has confirmed it. The hinges again." "Of course the hinges. Why seawater? Why only the brass? Why repeatedly? Why in a dry room? Someone wished to create not damage but meaning. A reminder, a summons, a warning, perhaps an instruction to open the chest. And Cross died because he understood it, or because he misunderstood it in a profitable direction. I spread my hands. That leaves the whole cast. It should cases with only one suspect are for imbeciles." He opened his eyes. "Telephone Saul Panzer, also Fred Durkin. I want the chandlery clerk identified, the dock receipt from Pier 91 traced, Daniel Cross's movements for the past week examined, and every person in that house watched or visited before breakfast. So you have a notion." "I have appetite. A notion will follow." Dinner was announced. Wolfe rose. Because death may interrupt business but never Fritz. At the door he paused and looked back. "Archie." Yes, the splinter matters. Dark paint is chosen, not accidental. Find what was painted black, and you may find what Cross touched before he died. He went to dinner. I stayed a moment, looking at my notes. A widow with a secret, a dead accountant, a hidden maritime past, a boathouse over black water, and seawater appearing where no water should be. It had the shape of a puzzle, but not yet its edges. Still, one thing was now certain. Whatever had been moving quietly through the Rudd house before dawn had decided, before noon, to kill. Chapter 4. The family circle the day after Daniel Cross was found in the reeds. The Rudd house had the strained quiet of a place where every chair, stair, and door seemed to expect testimony. A murder does that to a residence. It strips away comfort and leaves only arrangement. By the time I arrived that morning, the wind off the river had sharpened. The police had reduced their presence to one uniform and a sour smell of authority, and the household had settled into that dangerous interval when people begin deciding what version of the truth they can afford. Wolfe had sent me back with instructions so broad they were practically philosophy. See them all, he had said over breakfast. The widow, the dependents, the idle young, the servants, the indispensable menials, and the useful liars. In a house where money, secrecy, and death have met, one should inspect the family circle with gloves. So I did. Nora Pike admitted me and took me first to the morning room at the back, where Mrs. Rudd was with her daughter Clara. I had known from the earlier confusion that Clara was not living in the house, but had come in at once when she heard of Daniel's death. She rose when I entered, and the first thing I marked was that she had plainly been crying and had not attempted to improve the effect. That sounds minor, but it matters. Some people weep to persuade. Some weep because grief has its own schedule and does not ask permission. Clara belonged to the second class. She was in her early 30s, slender and dark-haired, with a face that would have been handsome under easier circumstances. Her eyes were swollen but direct. When she shook my hand, she did not overdo the tremor. "You are Mr. Goodwin," she said. "Yes. Mother says you ask direct questions, only when I suspect indirect answers." That brought the smallest lift at one corner of her mouth. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement that wit still existed in the world and might even be useful. Mrs. Rudd remained standing a moment, then sat again with the rigid control I had already learned to expect from her. Clara looked from her mother to me and said, "You want to know whether Daniel had become secretive. That would be a good beginning." He had. Mrs. Rudd turned sharply, but Clara went on. He was restless the last few weeks, evasive, easily startled. He would begin a sentence and abandon it if anyone entered the room. Twice he asked me for money, and once he asked for much more than he could reasonably explain. "How much?" $5,000. "That's more than nervous pocket change." "Yes." "Did you give it to him?" "Number reason given. He said he was close to settling something important and that if I trusted him one last time, he could clear the whole matter." "That sounds like a man either in trouble or about to create some." She nodded. "I thought so too." "Did he say trouble with whom?" "Not clearly. He hinted there were men in shipping who wanted him cornered." "Names?" "No names I would trust." He spoke in fragments. "Warehouses, freight claims, old transport holdings, things inherited from my father's files, perhaps, though I'm not certain." Mrs. Rudd said, "Clara, you need not speculate." "I'm not speculating," Clara said quietly. "I'm telling him what Daniel sounded like." That had weight, not because it proved anything, but because people who tell you how someone sounded often tell the truth more reliably than people who tell you what was said. I asked, "Was he afraid?" She thought before answering. "Not exactly. Excited, but the excitement had fear mixed into it, as if he believed he had finally found something valuable and only needed a little more nerve to turn it into money. That fitted Daniel Cross as I had seen him, smooth, self-possessed, and too pleased with his own control. Did he mention the Cedar Chest? That stopped her. Her eyes flicked to her mother. "No," she said. "But he had become curious about old family papers." "Your father's?" "Yes. or your grandfather's Captain Ezra Vale. Mrs. Rudd's head came up at once, but Clara only stared a moment and then said, "So you know that name." "I know it?" he asked once, whether my grandfather had ever gone by another surname. I thought it was an odd question and told him I didn't know enough to answer. Was that true? Mostly. That was a useful word. It usually means there is more, but not much more, and the speaker is aware of the difference. Clara folded her hands. "Mr. Goodwin, I am sorry for Daniel, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I was not blind. He had grown secretive, jumpy, and eager for money. He never explained. If he had stumbled into something ugly, I can believe it." That was honest, and not every widow can manage honesty before the flowers wilt. From there, I moved to the library, where Mrs. Rudd's nephew was waiting. The household had now settled on the name Ben Harrow, which was an improvement over the earlier variety. He was young, narrow, and carefully casual, with the look of a man who had read enough modern poetry to mistrust plain statements. His hands were too still. That is often as revealing as shaking. "You were here yesterday morning?" I asked. "Yes." "You heard something? A sound? What kind? A blow, perhaps, or wood striking wood? You told the police that?" "I told them I wasn't sure." "Are you sure now?" He hesitated, and that alone made the answer interesting. "Number Daniel Cross had enemies." "Yes." "How do you know?" He said so. "Whom did he name?" He shifted in the chair. "Men in shipping." "Such as?" He looked annoyed at the demand for specifics, which meant he had expected the phrase to earn credit on its own. "I don't know names," he said. "Not with confidence." That's a careful phrase. He flushed slightly. He complained that men in shipping could ruin someone quietly. "Who?" "I told you, I don't know." "When did he say it?" "Last week in the hall." Exact words. That trapped him. He had not expected exactness. After a second he said, "There are people in shipping who think I know less than I do." Something like that. Something like that. I repeated. He lifted his chin. "Do you think I'm lying?" "I think you've prepared the outline and neglected the details." That irritated him, but he had no answer ready. Good. A rehearsed liar hates being forced off script. I pressed him about Daniel's visits to the boathouse, his questions about old family papers, and whether he himself had ever seen Daniel near Mrs. Rudd's room after midnight. Each time Ben answered negatively, but with just enough delay to suggest that truth and convenience were being consulted in turn. The last member of the circle I wanted was the caretaker, Owen Pike. I found him outside near the boathouse, coiling line beside the path, as if rope could be trusted when people could not. He was stocky, weathered, and unimpressed by everyone. River men often are. They know that land people make too much of motive when plain greed and bad temper will explain half the city. "You handle the launch?" I asked. "When it's needed?" "Was it used the night before Cross died?" "Number. No boat at the dock." "Number," he said it promptly, which made it worth doubting. "Any visitors from the river?" "Number. Any lights in the boathouse?" I didn't look. "Your business includes not looking." He stared at me. "My business includes not inventing." That was better than most. I let my eyes drop to his boots. They were heavy rubber, and around the edges of both soles, fresh river mud still clung in a dark ring, not the dried residue of old work, but the wet, recent kind that keeps its shine. "You've been down close to the water this morning." "I work here." "You said no boat used the dock overnight." "That's right." "Then what brought you into the mud before breakfast?" He took half a second too long, checking a line under the landing. "What line?" "The spare stern line." "On which boat?" No answer then. "On the skiff." "There was no skiff in the slip, only the old one on blocks," I said. "Owen, when a man lies about water, he usually forgets that mud keeps records." That did not shake him outwardly, but it put a small hardness in his mouth. "Maybe. I went down to see where the police had been stepping. Am I not allowed curiosity?" "Of course. It's one of the commonest motives." He turned away then, and began fussing with the rope again, which was as good as a refusal and nearly as informative. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the whole report. Clara's honest grief and clear, eyed account of Daniel's new appetite for money, Ben Harrow's claims about enemies in shipping, delivered with the smoothness of something memorized. Owen Pike's denial that any boat had used the dock overnight, contradicted by the fresh river mud ringed around his boots. Wolfe listened with his eyes half shut. When I finished, he opened them and moved one finger against the desk blotter. "Clara weeps honestly," he said, "but not blindly. Therefore she is useful. The nephew offers shipping enemies without names. Therefore he is either protecting someone or imitating information overheard imperfectly. The caretaker denies river traffic while wearing the river on his boots. Therefore he is a fool, a liar, or both. That covers the field nicely. Number it merely plants flags." He leaned back. "The crucial point is the quality of the lies. The daughter's truth contains pain. The nephew's contains preparation. The caretaker's contains mud." I grinned. "You're becoming poetic. Number merely accurate. Lies told indoors seldom dry as fast as wet metal. That was Wolfe. Give him a widow, a corpse, muddy boots, and a household full of soft evasions, and he would reduce them all to one line that sounded like epigram and operated like a knife." I said, "So which one is the worst liar?" He closed his eyes again. "That depends, Archie, on which one knows why seawater appears where no water should be." Chapter 5. The Cedar Chest opened by noon. Wolfe had reached the stage of irritation that means he is ready to act. Until then he had done what he always does when facts are incomplete, sat still, consumed beer at proper intervals, insulted speculation, and let Archie Goodwin exhaust shoe leather in the vulgar world. But after my report on Clara Cross, Ben Harrow, and Owen Pike's muddy boots, something in his inward machinery aligned with a click I have learned to recognize. "The chest," he said. I looked up from my notes. "What about it? We have tolerated its existence too respectfully. That is a common error with old furniture and old lies. Arrange for Mrs. Rudd to bring the key or the chest itself. If neither is possible, we shall go there. Rowcliffe has already poured through it." He opened a container. "I wish to examine an idea." There is no point arguing with Wolfe when he speaks that way. He doesn't persuade, he annexes. I telephoned Mrs. Rudd, and after a pause long enough to contain alarm, shame, resistance, and decision, she said she would come at once. She arrived an hour later, pale but steady, with the key in her bag and the expression of a woman who had begun to suspect that withholding facts from Nero Wolfe was like saving crumbs from a hog. She sat in the red leather chair opposite Wolfe's desk. While I stood by the globe and watched him, he did not begin with courtesy. "Madam," he said, "the cedar chest in your bedroom is no longer an heirloom. It is an instrument. We must know whether it has been altered, used, searched, or emptied." "It has been opened twice by the police already," she said. "That is unfortunate for them. It remains necessary for us." She looked at me, then back to him. "If you must, I must." We went to the house at once. Wolfe hates leaving the brownstone during business hours, but he hates ignorance more, which is the only compliment I can pay the case. The trip across town did nothing for his temper. Traffic offended him, weather offended him, and the idea of investigating furniture on its native premises offended him in principle. By the time we reached the Rudd place, he had settled into a silence so concentrated that it might have qualified as weather of its own. Mrs. Rudd took us upstairs to the bedroom. The room remained dry, orderly, respectable, and faintly hostile. If a room can resent scrutiny, that one did. The cedar chest stood where it had stood before, at the foot of the bed, dark and patient, with its brass hinges now dull and innocent in the afternoon light. Wolfe did not touch it at first. He stood over it, massive and motionless, his eyes narrowed, taking in proportion grain, metal, placement, and relation to the room. Then he said, "Open it." Mrs. Rudd produced the key. The lid rose on the familiar breath of cedar. Blankets, shawls, old linens, and the reduced contents. The police had left in place were stacked with moderate neatness. Wolfe looked once and said, "Remove them." I did. One blanket, then another, folded table linen, old papers, ribbon, bound letters, an empty space where the Japan tin box had evidently been, and beneath all of it, the cedar lining of the chest floor, smooth and reputable. Wolfe grunted. "What?" I asked. "The depth." I looked. The chest was nearly 2 feet deep outside, perhaps a little more, but the usable inside depth from lid lip to floor seemed closer to 14 inches. That by itself was not remarkable. Old chests often cheat a little in the interest of structure, but Wolfe had already bent slightly. Not much, because he bends only under protest, and was studying the corners with the concentration he usually reserves for orchids threatened by incompetence. "Knuckle," he said. I rapped the cedar floor with my knuckles. It gave a tidy wooden sound. Again, front, then rear. I did front, sharp and solid, rear. Duller, Mrs. Rudd said. "What is it? Possibly carpentry," Wolfe said. "Archie, the ruler." He measured the interior depth, then the exterior height from floor to upper rim. His lips moved once without sound. "There is too little inside," he said. "Open the lid fully. Examine the lining." The cedar floor had been cut in 3 broad planks or panels. Their seams fitted so neatly that ordinary curiosity would have accepted them for what they pretended to be. But ordinary curiosity was not in the room. I knelt, ran my finger along the rear seam, and found that while the front joints were flush and dry with age, the one near the back held the faint stickiness of old pitch under fresh abrasion. "Something has been moved," I said. Wolfe nodded once. "Lift it." "It doesn't want to." "Persuade." I used a penknife first, and then, with Mrs. Rudd's permission and a glance from Wolfe that made permission irrelevant, a thin screwdriver borrowed from Owen Pike's work bench downstairs, slipped carefully into the seam. It found resistance and then a grudging yield. A concealed panel lifted 1/2 inch. Mrs. Rudd made a soft sound, not surprise exactly, but recognition arriving late. I got fingers under the edge and raised it. The cedar floor came up as a false bottom, neatly fitted, not crude improvisation, but professional joinery. Beneath it was a hidden compartment, the length and width of the chest, shallow but ample enough to hold flat objects, bundles, packets, or any secret patient enough to lie under blankets for years. It was lined with tarred cloth. The black fabric had been trimmed and set snug to the cavity walls, its seams sealed with pitch or marine compound. It was meant to repel water, or damp, or any ordinary household accident that might soak what was hidden there. That was not family sentiment. That was caution with a specific enemy in mind. "It's empty," Mrs. Rudd whispered. "Yes," I said, "but empty is a misleading word. A recently emptied place talks if you give it time." I bent and put my face close to the compartment. Cedar still carried above it, but under that came other smells. River damp, old tar, pitch, and a sour trace left by paper handled recently and removed in haste. Anyone who has spent time around docks knows the layered odor of waterproofing, wet rope, and enclosed river air. It was all there, but faintly, as if the compartment had been opened more than once in the last few days, and whatever had rested there was no longer resting anywhere. Wolfe, who would rather smell 10 orchids than 1 crime, nevertheless inhaled once and made a face. "River," I said. "Yes, and documents, papers stored close." "Recently removed," Wolfe said. Mrs. Rudd gripped the back of a chair. "I never knew." He turned his head and looked at her. "Madam, that may be true, but it is no longer helpful. I swear to you, I neither need nor value oaths. Did your husband ever open this chest in your presence?" "Only the upper part. Never this." "Did Daniel Cross know of the compartment?" "I don't know." That answer is wearing thin. She closed her eyes a moment. He had become curious about old family papers. He asked whether Mr. Rudd kept anything outside the study files. I told him no. I thought it was no. Wolfe's nostrils widened. "You thought it was no because you preferred it to be no." That hit home. She did not answer. I examined the underside of the false panel. The wood had been reinforced with narrow strips, and on one corner were faint smears of black, not paint exactly, more like tar transferred from the lining or from an object stored there. On the inner wall of the compartment, one small area had been rubbed clean enough to show recent scraping, as if some hard-edged bundle or box had been dragged out carelessly. There was something sizable in here, I said. Documents in packets, maybe a ledger, maybe a box, or several flat packages, Wolfe said. Tarred cloth to protect against damp seawater, on the hinges to compel attention. The compartments of the case begin to resemble one another. I straightened. You think whoever wetted the hinges wanted the chest opened because of this compartment? Wanted someone to know it existed? Yes, or to fear that someone else knew. Mrs. Rudd said. Then Daniel found it. Possibly, Wolfe said, and removed what it contained. Then someone killed him for it. Possibly. I looked at the empty compartment again. If he took the contents, where are they now? Wolfe made a noise through his nose. If I knew, Archie, the police would already be disappointed. There was another point. The tarred cloth had not merely been set for dryness. It had been laid as if the maker expected exposure to water from outside the chest, not from within the room. That reminded me of something I had not liked since the beginning. If seawater kept appearing only on the brass, maybe someone was applying it from outside to mark the chest without soaking the wood. Or from inside by touching metal connected to hidden contents, Wolfe said. Number better, someone had access to a damp, tarred, river-kept object once stored below and used the hinges as a signal by transfer. Repetition matters. It was not a single accidental smear. Mrs. Rudd stared at him. Please, speak plainly. He turned to her with ill grace. The chest has been used as a repository for concealed maritime papers or objects. Someone connected with those contents wished to force remembrance. The wet hinges were a message. The false bottom is the grammar of it. That did not comfort her much, which was fortunate, because truth rarely deserves that reputation. I took out the ribbon, bound letters and checked them again, this time more thoroughly. Most were domestic enough. Weather, business fatigue, dinner complaints, family gossip, but here and there old Captain Ezra Vale slipped in, even when signing as father or husband. There were references to cargo delayed at Red Hook, a packet secured against damp, and once, in a line that made me read it twice. What is safest must lie where women store the harmless things men never notice. That was nearly a confession, though old men with maritime pasts are capable of writing practical instructions as if they were epigrams. I showed the sentence to Wolfe. He read it and grunted. The man had vanity and a chest. Yes. Mrs. Rudd had come closer now, though unwillingly. May I see? I handed her the letter. She read the line and went white in a manner. No powder can imitate. My husband knew, she said. Of course, Wolfe replied. Whether he knew the contents, or merely the method remains to be learned. I replaced the letter and lowered the false bottom carefully back into place, though not so carefully as to preserve illusions. The compartment had done that work long enough. As we went downstairs, Wolfe paused once on the landing to catch his breath, not from illness, but from the offensive necessity of vertical travel. He looked back toward the bedroom door. Old furniture, he said. Often serves crime because age discourages curiosity. People bow to antiques and assume honesty from Polish, I said. That applies to more than furniture. Yes, it applies to families. Down in the library, I telephoned the Brownstone for Saul Panzer and got him on the line. Wolfe took the extension, which was rare enough to make me listen harder, Saul. We need Daniel Cross's movements again, but with one correction, assume he discovered or removed concealed papers from a false compartment in a cedar chest. Search his apartment, his office, his bank box, if you can provoke access, and his acquaintance list among shipping clerks, warehouse men, and document handlers. Also inquire whether he recently sought to sell, copy, or appraise old maritime papers. He listened, grunted, and hung up. Mrs. Rudd said, "What were they, those papers?" Wolfe settled into a chair without invitation because his size abolishes that formality. That, he said, depends on why a compartment meant to repel water was hidden in a bedroom chest and why seawater was used to announce its importance decades later. They may be records of fraud, title, blackmail, ownership, or crime. At present, they are absence. Absence is informative but not yet articulate. I leaned against the mantel, and Daniel Cross died before he could become articulate too. Wolfe looked at me, or because he had already done so, to the wrong person. That was the chapter's real state when we left the house. An open chest, an empty cavity, tarred cloth, river smell, and the certainty that something once hidden there had crossed from family secret into present danger. The false bottom had not given us the missing papers, but it had given us a shape. Sometimes that is enough to keep a murderer from sleeping and a detective from needing to. Chapter 6. Papers from the water. By the time Chapter 6 began to take shape, Daniel Cross had improved in one respect. Being dead, he had stopped explaining himself. That was useful, because alive he had apparently made a practice of talking around facts until they lost the will to stand upright. What he left behind was better. Drawers, memoranda, receipts, and the sort of private markings men use when they believe that shorthand is the same thing as secrecy. The morning after we opened the false bottom of the Cedar Chest, Wolfe sent me out with 2 instructions. Search Cross's desk, he said, and do not return merely having looked at it. That was all. With Wolfe, brevity is usually either contempt or confidence. In this case, it was confidence, and I prefer that from him because it saves time. Daniel Cross kept an office downtown, on the 3rd floor of a modest building near the lower river, where insurance brokers, shipping agents, and other respectable scavengers lived by invoices and delay claims. Saul Panzer had already learned enough to get me in without ceremony. Cross's landlord, a dry little man with polished spectacles, had decided after one evening with homicide detectives that any further search conducted by a man in a good hat was probably legal enough for his taste. The office suited Cross exactly. It was neat without being honest, tasteful without generosity, and efficient in the same way a locked drawer is efficient. The desk was walnut veneer, with brass pulls. There were 2 filing cabinets, 1 correspondence tray, 1 map of the river and upriver wharves pinned to a side wall, and an odor of paper, dust and stale tobacco over everything. A dead man's office never feels empty at once. First it feels paused, as if the owner has only stepped out to lie to someone in the hall. I began with the desk. The top drawer yielded the usual tribute to business: pencils, envelopes, a sealing stamp, bank slips, 2 unpaid bills, and a cheap revolver without cartridges. That interested me just enough to note it. A man who keeps an unloaded gun in his desk either expects to threaten the timid or reassure himself. The right pedestal held routine files at the top and less routine material below. In the second drawer, I found a leather memorandum book, not hidden exactly, but buried under freight circulars and invoices, as if Cross had wanted to be able to reach it quickly while preserving the right to deny that it existed. The pages were filled in a tight upright hand with initials, dates, doc references and times. Not names, initials. Not destinations, marks. Not descriptions, codes. I sat down and began copying. Ebel Fay 2 PKGs Fay 11:40 p.m. Fay Ope confirmed. Hey Fay, anchor mark, Fay clear tide. At a house per Dalton Dwan. Withheld pending ledger. There were dozens of entries, many of them too thin to mean anything alone, but 3 patterns appeared at once. First, Cross had been tracking deliveries or handoffs on specific nights. Second, some entries carried a tiny hand, drawn anchor in the margin. Third, several referred to house with a capital H, which in a river office might mean anything. If I didn't already know a house on the river with a boathouse, a false, bottomed, cedar chest, and a widow whose brass hinges turned wet at dawn. He went through the drawers more carefully. In the lower left I found a folder labeled Storage Adjustments, which was a liar's title if ever one existed. Inside were sheets of ordinary business paper covered, not with accounts, but with cross, indexes, parcel counts, initials, night tides, and what appeared to be launch times. One sheet listed: 11:15 South Slip, 12:05 House, 4:40, Open 6:10 Pass. And another were 3 columns headed only in Hold and Onward. Under Onward were initials followed by places inland: Yonkers, White Plains, Patterson, Newark, even one marked Albany Buyers. Recipients, intermediaries, whatever they were not entered like legal shipments. The thing that fixed it was a separate paper tucked into the folder as if Cross had been using it as a marker. It was headed with the printed name of the Town Warehouse Association, but the lines beneath were blank except for dates. No parcel numbers, no intake marks, no clerk initials. In other words, nights, when goods or papers had moved and never entered the town warehouse books at all. I leaned back and looked at the river map on the wall. Pinned along it were 3 colored tacks, one near Pier 91, one at a chandlery upriver, and one at the narrow stretch of river beside the Rudd property. Men may lie with numbers, but maps betray intention by what they bother to remember. I spent another 40 minutes at it, and finished with copies of every coded entry that seemed tied to the house, the boathouse, or the anchor marks. Then I telephoned Wolfe from the outer office. "Yes, it's Cross's desk, evidently. You were right. I am often right. Be specific." Coded notes, launch times. Parcel entries by initials. Several pages suggest regular movement from river to house to inland recipients. The warehouse books don't show the traffic. Silence for 2 seconds. That was Wolfe listening, not doubting. I continued. Certain nights are marked with a small anchor in the margin. One sheet lists times that read like river: arrival, house stop, dawn opening, and onward pass. Another lists inland names or buyers, probably buyers, without legal shipping entries. "Liquor?" Wolfe asked. "Number wrong age for romance. Wrong paperwork for contraband cases, I know, and wrong caution for mere booze. Jewels, no indication. Then documents. That's my guess. Papers, ledgers, titles, manifests, things flat enough to ride in the cedar chest under tarred cloth." Come home. When I returned to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office with beer at his elbow, and the expression of a man who has decided that reality, while still offensive, has at least begun to organize itself. I spread my copies on his desk and gave him the full account, including the map tacks, the anchor symbols, and the omitted warehouse entries. He read slowly, grunting once at the anchor marks and twice at the R to house per Dalton 1 line. "At last," he said, "something with bones. More than bones. It moves." "Yes." He laid one large finger on the page. "Not jewels, Archie. Not liquor. Not any vulgar smuggling one finds in cheap fiction documents. Papers brought ashore under darkness, protected from spray, concealed in the house until morning, then passed onward in daylight, through legal channels or near enough to resemble them." That's what I thought. Of course you thought it. The false compartment required flat contents, the tarred cloth required water protection, and the inland names require portability without bulk. Cross was not trafficking in bottles, he was trafficking in papers. I sat down. "What sort of papers?" He shrugged impatiently. "Bills of lading, false claims, warehouse receipts, titles, manifests, insurance instruments, securities, ownership transfers. Any document whose value increases when separated from official knowledge." That suited the desk. It also suited the dead man. I said, "Then the Rudd house was a way station." "Exactly. The boathouse receives, the chest holds. Morning distributes. A family residence is ideal because policemen respect curtains more than cargo sheds." He read again, then tapped the anchor marks. "These nights with the symbol, what do they coincide with? Tides, maybe, or launches. Both. The symbol is not poetry, it is schedule." I took out another sheet. One entry reads, "Up confirmed, Owen Pike." That was my thought. Yes, the caretaker handles the launch, denies river traffic, and wears fresh mud on his boots. He is inside the chain. And Daniel Cross, inside enough to count, outside enough to be killed. That had a clean sound, because it was probably true. I got up and crossed to the window, partly from habit, and partly because once Wolfe has arranged facts into a pattern, it is useful to move around and look at the pattern from a new angle. Then the wet hinges. He cut in at once. Hands. I turned. What? Hands fresh from the boathouse lifting the lid before dawn. That sat there a moment, he went on. Why did the hinges alone grow wet? Because the person opening the chest had wet, salt-contaminated fingers, not enough water to soak the wood, not enough spray to touch the blankets, but sufficient to leave moisture on the metal grasped. During lifting, brass shows it. Wood absorbs it or hides it. Repetition explains the recurring dawn appearance. I considered the room in my mind. Dark, the chest at the foot of the bed, someone entering before dawn from the riverside of the house, handling the lid with hands still damp from rope, pilings or spray, then removing or depositing papers from the hidden compartment. The widow slept through it, perhaps once, then later noticed only the result. A woman may ignore one unexplained morning and remember the third. And Daniel Cross. Cross discovered the hidden trade, perhaps by chance, perhaps by greed, perhaps because old papers in the house led him toward it. He inserted himself, kept coded notes, tracked parcels, and likely removed something from the compartment that others wanted restored. I looked again at the copied entries. One line says, "Withheld pending ledger." Yes, that may have killed him. There it was, not a theory yet, but the beginning of one. Cross had not merely handled the traffic. He had attempted leverage. I said, "Then the chest didn't store treasure," Wolfe snorted. "On the contrary, documents are often the purest treasure because they weigh nothing and ruin everyone." That was Wolfe too. He could make paper sound more dangerous than dynamite, and nearly always had evidence for it. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and spoke as if dictating to some invisible clerk in his own head. The river route is regular. The house is complicit. Owen Pike is involved. Cross kept records outside the main books and intended private profit. The wet hinges are the physical residue of dawn access by someone arriving from the boathouse. Therefore, the problem is no longer what the chest concealed, but which current participant feared exposure when Cross altered the arrangement. I said, "And which participant is still moving papers?" He opened his eyes. Precisely. That ended the chapter where it ought to end, with the case no longer atmospheric but mechanical. The house on the river had not been brooding over old scandal for sentimental reasons. It had been functioning cargo from the water, not of crates or liquor, but of paper. Documents brought under darkness, shielded from spray, hidden in the cedar chest, and passed onward after daylight in forms respectable enough to enter the city unnoticed. And once Wolfe had that, the wet hinges were no longer mysterious at all. They were fingerprints made by dawn. Chapter 7. The splinter and the launch the case had reached the stage Wolfe likes best and I like least. He had enough facts to grow confident, and not enough to grow comfortable, which meant he sat in his chair looking like a large, annoyed monument, while I did the walking required to turn suspicion into proof. By then we knew the Rudd house had been serving as a discreet way station for papers brought in from the river. We knew Daniel Cross had kept coded notes on the traffic, that the cedar chest had a false bottom lined against damp, and that somebody with wet hands had been opening it before dawn. What we did not yet know was who had struck Cross dead beside the boathouse, and whether he had been a courier, a blackmailer, or merely a fool who had mistaken secrecy for ownership. Wolfe sent me back to the river with one instruction. "The splinter," he said. "It broke from something. Find what?" That sounds simple when said by a man in a red leather chair. At the Rudd place the weather had gone still, which made the water look blacker and the house more watchful. I went first to the boathouse because crime scenes sulk if neglected. Owen Pike was there, planing a short board with a concentration he had no doubt adopted for my benefit. He glanced up once, saw me, and decided not to improve the welcome. "Morning," I said. He grunted. "That's friendly." He kept planing. "Didn't know friendliness was under orders." "Not yet. We're still on facts." I stepped past him and looked around. The boathouse had changed in one small but important respect. Tied behind it, Where the rear slip narrowed into shadow and reeds was a skiff I had not previously seen in the water. It was a narrow workboat, painted black with age and fresh patching, practical and ugly in the efficient style of small craft, intended to go unnoticed at night. One gunwale had been recently repainted. The paint was still duller there, not fully cured. I turned to Owen. "That yours? It's the house skiff." "Funny, last time it was up on blocks." "Not that one, another. Convenient house, always another." He said nothing. I went down to the edge, crouched and examined the side. The paint was black, marine enamel, worn thin along most of the length but fresh at the stern quarter. A small chip had broken away near the rib. The exposed wood beneath was pale and raw. I touched the edge lightly. The plain fact was waiting for me before I had even taken the sample. The break looked like kin to the splinter taken from Daniel Cross's hand. "You mind if I scrape a little?" I asked. "Yes, I admire honesty." I scraped anyway, taking only a flake of paint and a shaving from the fresh edge with my pocket knife. Owen stepped forward once and then stopped, which told me he knew that stopping me would look worse than letting me continue. "This boat hasn't left its rope," he said. "That's a poetic sentence for a caretaker." "It's true. Then you won't mind telling me when it was last used?" "I already told the police no boat used the dock that night." "Yes, and your boots told me something else. I'm still deciding which witness has better character." His jaw moved once. A man can step in mud without taking a voyage. Certainly, he can also lie without writing it down. That's why God invented detectives. I straightened and looked inside the skiff. Nothing dramatic. Oars, a boat hook, a stained canvas sheet, one lantern, and a metal bracket near the bow, where something cylindrical had lately been strapped down. The straps were missing, but the rubbed marks remained. I asked, "What rides there?" "Nothing." "Something did." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Maybe a survey tube. Maybe tools. Maybe I don't keep a diary of objects." That interested me because he had named a category before I had suggested one. "Survey tube." He shrugged. "Rivermen carry gear. Charts, rods, papers, you know." "Yes," I said. "I'm learning." I left him to the plane and drove uptown with the paint shaving in an envelope. The police had been decent enough to let me inspect the splinter earlier, and while I am no laboratory, a man can compare grain, thickness, paint color, and finish without a degree. At the office, I spread both on Wolfe's desk. He leaned forward, peered, and made a small satisfied noise. "The same," I said. "The same paint, certainly. Probably the same wood. Therefore the splinter broke from the skiff. Or from something painted with the same batch." He glared. "Do not practice caution merely because it is fashionable." That was as close to approval as he usually gets before lunch. I told him about the metal bracket in the bow and Owen's volunteered mention of a survey tube. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Archie, the chandlery receipt. I had it copied in my notebook. Brass cleat, braided line, black marine paint, copper tacks, and that's all. Number that is what the receipt appeared to say to a casual reader. Return to the chandlery." So, I returned. The chandlery upriver sat between a fuel berth and a cooperage that had outlived its proper century by refusing to improve. The clerk remembered Daniel Cross at once, which suggested either good memory or a clientele too dull to compete. "Yes," he said. "City fellow. Gloves too nice for rope." That sounds like him. He wanted something to keep papers dry. That sharpened the day for me, papers. The clerk nodded. Didn't say papers, but asked for dry carriage in spray, compact size, easy lash to a skiff. I showed him waterproof cylinders. Survey crews use them, sometimes engineers, sometimes men who don't volunteer what they survey. Did he buy one? Yes, two, in fact, small rubber. Sealed caps better than oilcloth. If a man's fool enough to carry documents by water, then why does the receipt list rope and tack? The clerk gave me the look shopkeepers reserve for men who assume receipts reflect truth. Because he asked me not to itemize it plain, said his expense account was being reviewed by idiots. I wrote generic tackle goods and charged the same amount. Happens. There it was. Cross had not bought tackle for repairs. He had bought waterproof cylinders used by survey crews and smugglers alike to keep papers dry. Any idea where he was headed? Number, but he asked about back channels near the East Bank and whether a skiff could drift quiet without shipping its load. That was enough for me. I took a description of the cylinders, thanked him, and went back to the brownstone with the feeling a case gives when it finally stops hinting and begins speaking in nouns. Wolfe listened without interrupting, which is one of the great honors. When I finished, he opened his eyes. So not rope, not tackle waterproof cylinders. Yes. He asked for papers. Yes. He bought them the morning he died. Yes. Wolfe folded his hands on his stomach. Then Daniel Cross had either joined the courier chain or intended to intercept it. That was my thought. Of course it was. It is the only respectable thought available. I sat. He could have meant to move documents out of the chest himself, or to keep some back, or to prove he had access. A blackmailer likes samples. We let that sit. In cases involving paper, samples matter more than guns, I said. The splinter from his hand matches the skiff. The skiff has a bracket for carrying tubes. Cross buys waterproof cylinders that morning. If he wasn't already part of the traffic, he was making himself part of it fast. Yes. And Owen Pike lies about the boat moving. Yes. And someone kills Cross before noon. Yes. Wolfe shut his eyes again. Men who carry papers for criminals often imagine paper to be harmless because it makes no noise when it ruins them. That was Wolfe at his best. One line, dry as dust and twice as final. I got up and paced once to the window and back. Then Cross may have thought he could skim the operation. Take a few packets, copy a few names, demand a payoff. Certainly he was vain enough. But who struck him? Owen. Someone meeting the skiff, someone from the house. Wolfe opened his eyes. The question improves, not who had motive in general, but who needed the transfer route preserved at that exact moment. Cross buys waterproof cylinders in the morning. Therefore he intended immediate use. He was not planning a future hobby. Which means he had expected papers to move that day. Precisely. I sat again. Then there must have been a scheduled transfer. Wolfe nodded at my copied notes. The anchor marks, the launch times. One of those nights or mornings corresponds to a regular movement. Cross knew it, prepared for it, and died before he could profit, I said. So the murderer didn't just silence him, he prevented a delivery from changing hands. Yes, that gave the whole thing a firmer spine. Before, Daniel Cross had looked like a dead opportunist beside a boathouse. Now he looked like a man who had either tried to join a river courier scheme or stumbled into it too deeply to retreat. He had bought the tools. He had kept coded timings. He had gotten his hand on the skiff, and someone had struck him down before the papers could move out under his control. Wolfe reached for beer, took a swallow, and said, "Now we have function." The skiff carries papers in waterproof cylinders from some upriver source to the Rudd boathouse. The chest holds them temporarily. At dawn, or after, they are distributed onward. Cross discovered the mechanism and prepared to divert or appropriate one shipment. The splinter shows physical contact with the skiff at the moment of death, either because he seized it, boarded it, or was struck against it, or because he tried to stop someone casting off. Wolfe's eyes rested on me a second. Better, that is likely. I grinned. Thank you. Do not become excited. Accuracy is not a moral triumph. That was fair, I let it pass. That was fair, I let it pass. By evening, Saul Panzer had another piece for us. One of the inland initials in Cross's notes matched a small legal copying firm in White Plains that specialized in title abstracts and old deed transfers. Not glamorous merchandise. Dangerous merchandise. The kind of paper that can rearrange ownership after the right signatures disappear and the wrong ones surface. So the chapter ended where it should, with the splinter no longer a scrap of wood but a witness. The skiff no longer an idle boat but a carrier, and Daniel Cross no longer merely curious, but implicated. Somewhere upriver, documents were being packed into waterproof cylinders, carried through darkness, brought to the Rudd boathouse, and passed toward respectable inland hands by daylight. Cross had put his fingers on that machine, and the machine, like most profitable ones, had answered by trying to crush them. Chapter 8. The break in the pattern up to that point, the case had behaved like a river map copied by a liar. Enough lines to suggest direction, never enough to trust the channel. We knew the house had been used. We knew the Cedar Chest had held documents protected from spray and damp. We knew Daniel Cross had kept coded notes, bought waterproof cylinders, and died with a splinter from the skiff in his hand. But Wolfe, who has a low opinion of any theory that arrives before its shoes are tied, kept turning one question over and would not let me evade it. If strangers from the river had used the chest for months, he said, why kill Cross on this particular morning? I offered him 3 possibilities before lunch and 2 after. He rejected them all with variations of the same grunt. It is not enough that Cross became inconvenient, he said. He must have become newly inconvenient. The pattern broke. Find where. So I went back to the house. The air there had gone stale with nerves. Houses that live by concealment do not improve when secrets begin dying in the reeds. Nora Pike let me in without comment and told me Mrs. Rudd was resting. Clara was upstairs, and Ben Harrow was in the library pretending to read. That last part she did not say, but servants communicate more than vocabulary permits. I found Ben with a book open and his eyes nowhere near it. He was young enough to believe tension can be hidden by posture. It cannot. You and Daniel Cross quarreled the night before he died, I said. His eyes lifted slowly. Did we? Yes. Who says so? I do. That annoyed him because it was not a source he could challenge. We had words, loud enough to be heard. I don't know. About what? He closed the book. You are very fond of direct attack, Mr. Goodwin, and you are very fond of delay. Let us both keep our hobbies. He hesitated, then said, Daniel had become reckless. Financially, in every direction. With you, with all of us. That was better. I sat opposite him. Try again without the poetry. He licked his lip once. He said he was tired of taking crumbs. From whom? No answer. Ben. He looked at the door and back. He said there would be one last run. There it was. What run? He made an angry gesture. You know perfectly well what kind. Yes, I want to hear your version. He said one last run. And after that he would not be dictated to by people who lacked nerve. He was excited, triumphant almost. I told him he was behaving like a fool. And then he said there was enough in it to finish us all. That sat between us a moment. Exact words? I asked. Close enough. They sound close enough to be exact. He flushed. Perhaps they are exact. Meaning what? I don't know. That answer is beginning to rot. His hands tightened on the closed book. He meant that if certain papers were exposed, no one connected with them would survive the scandal. Financially, socially, perhaps legally. Is that plain enough? Very. And you knew this how? I inferred it. From what? From the way he talked. From what he hinted. What had he seen? I don't know. That was probably false, but not entirely. Ben Harrow knew enough to fear the subject, and not enough to manage it well. Did he threaten you personally? Numbered, did he threaten Mrs. Rudd? Not directly. Who was included in US All? He stared at me. That is the question, isn't it? Yes, he gave a short, unhappy laugh. Then asked someone older. That was evasive, but it was also informative. Young liars usually overreach. Frightened young men sometimes point. I left him and went upstairs to Clara Cross. She was in the small front room set aside for guests, sitting by the window with her gloves in her lap as if she had forgotten both to put them on and to put them away. Grief had settled on her now, not theatrical, not even especially visible, but present in the fatigue around her mouth. Ben says Daniel spoke of one last run. I told her. She closed her eyes for a second. Then Ben finally decided to be useful. That would be a novelty. Did Daniel say the same to you? Not in those words. What words then? She looked at me steadily. He said that if they tried to cut him out, he would take certain papers to the authorities. That improved the room at once. Authorities, I repeated. Police. He did not specify. He may have meant district attorneys, federal men, revenue people, shipping investigators. I don't know. Daniel liked threats that sounded larger than his courage. Did he name anyone? Number, did he mean people outside the house? She shook her head slowly. Number, that was the worst of it. He was not afraid of mysterious men from the river. He was angry with someone near him, someone he believed owed him his share. That was the break in the pattern Wolfe had wanted. Smugglers, document runners, forgers, whatever this breed of paper thieves should be called, can be tolerated for months, if the machine runs smoothly. Murder becomes immediate, only when the machine jams from inside. I said, when did he tell you this? The day before he died, he came to see me in Hartford. He was wild with certainty. He said he had been patient long enough, that there would be one final transfer, and after that, he would either be paid properly, or he would ruin everyone. Every own, yes. Did he say what the papers were? Number only that they were worse than money because they could reach backward as well as forward. That sounded like Daniel. I went back to the brownstone and gave Wolfe the whole of it. Ben Harrow admitting the quarrel, Daniel's phrase about one last run, the line about enough to finish us all, and Clara's account that Daniel had threatened to take papers to the authorities if he was cut out of the arrangement. Wolfe listened without moving except to close his eyes. When I had finished, he opened them and looked at me as if I had finally arrived with the item he ordered. Yes, he said, now the pattern breaks, because the threat changed everything. Because it localized everything. Cross was not killed by distant river men protecting a route. He was killed by a partner already inside the house or immediately attached to it. Only such a person would face immediate destruction from exposure and know that Cross intended action that very day. I sat down. So not an outside courier. Outside men can replace a courier. They do not kill at once unless cargo is at risk in hand. But a partner in the house, a widow, a relative, a servant, a caretaker, a family dependent. Such a person faces not merely lost traffic, but collapse, scandal, prosecution, ruin. The phrase "finish us all" exactly. Cross was not speaking of anonymous rogues on the river. He was speaking of a circle. I looked at my notes. Mrs. Rudd, Clara, Ben Harrow, Owen Pike, Nora, if she knew enough, maybe others. Wolfe grunted. Reduce it. A murderer must possess fear, access, and knowledge of the transfer schedule. And Daniel had just announced one last run. Yes, murder became immediate, not because the operation existed, but because Cross intended to change its terms. That was the point of the chapter, and it had weight enough to end on. Daniel Cross had not died because a river scheme was dangerous in general. He had died because he had threatened to crack it open from inside. Once he said, one last run. Once he hinted that the papers were enough to finish us all. The murder no longer pointed outward to shadowy traffickers upriver. It pointed inward to a partner who slept under the same roof or walked its paths in daylight. Chapter 9. Wolfe draws the net when Wolfe is ready to gather people in the front room. The case has entered its last civilized phase. After that come discomfort, disclosure, and the police. He dislikes all three, but he dislikes incompletion more. By 6 o'clock that evening, the brownstone had admitted Mrs. Rudd, Clara Cross, Ben Harrow, Owen Pike, and Inspector Kramer, with Archie Goodwin attending as furniture that takes notes. Kramer arrived first, broad, suspicious, and already annoyed because Wolfe had not explained why he was wanted. That is one of Wolfe's more childish pleasures. Kramer endures it only because now and then it results in a murderer with nowhere left to stand. I'm here, Kramer said. But if this is another performance about wet brass, You will sit down, Wolfe told him, and postpone your threats until they can be properly appreciated. Kramer sat. Mrs. Rudd entered with the composure of someone who had spent the last 2 days discovering that self-command is not the same as safety. Clara came with her, pale but steady. Ben Harrow came alone, too careful not to look alarmed. Owen Pike stood near the door as if wishing to remain close to escape without seeming to intend it. I had already brought the cedar chest in from the bedroom at Wolfe's instructions and placed it where everyone could see it. That produced the effect Wolfe wanted. A thing can be ignored in its native corner, in the center of a room, under lamplight. It becomes evidence. No, one sat comfortably. Wolfe let the silence work until each of them had looked at the chest and away from it at least once. Then he said, "This matter began, apparently, with wet brass hinges. It did not begin there. It merely announced itself there." Mrs. Rudd observed moisture on these hinges at dawn and assumed, reasonably, some freak of weather, leak, or metal. Mr. Goodwin observed that the moisture smelled of salt water. The room was dry. Therefore damp weather was excluded. Kramer grunted. "Get on with it." "I am on with it. If you cannot distinguish progress from motion, that is not my failure." Kramer opened his mouth. I caught his eye and shook my head once. He shut it. Wolfe laid one finger on the chest lid. The hinges were wet because this chest was being opened before dawn by someone coming directly from the river. Hands salted and chilled from wet rope, spray, and the launch line touched the brass repeatedly. The wood concealed the transfer. The metal displayed it. Clara made a faint sound. Mrs. Rudd did not move at all. Wolfe went on. The false bottom beneath the cedar lining has already been demonstrated. It was lined with tarred cloth to protect documents from damp. Not jewels, not liquor, not trinkets. Documents. Papers brought by water under darkness, concealed here until morning, and then passed onward. Kramer leaned forward. What papers? Stolen, forged, or diverted commercial papers. Title records, manifests, and related instruments. Cross's notes, recovered by Mr. Goodwin, proved a pattern of river deliveries, dawn openings, and inland recipients outside normal warehouse records. Kramer's eyes shifted to me, then back to Wolfe. Cross was in it. Yes, he managed transfers. He kept notes. He bought waterproof cylinders the morning he died, because he intended to alter the arrangement to his own advantage. Wolfe paused and let that settle. Mr. Cross, he said, made a common mistake. Men who carry papers for criminals often imagine paper to be harmless because it makes no noise when it ruins them. He knew enough to bargain, and not enough to survive bargaining. Ben Harrow moved then, only a little, but enough. His shoulders tightened, and his right hand touched his knee as if checking whether it was still there. Wolfe turned his head and looked at him. "The question," Wolfe said, "was never whether strangers from the river might kill to protect a route. Such men kill when cargo is at risk in hand. But if that route had been operating for months, why kill Cross on that particular morning? Because the pattern broke. The danger was no longer external. It was immediate and domestic." Ben said, too quickly. "That proves nothing." "Sit still," Wolfe said. "You quarreled with Cross the night before. You discussed one last run and something enough to finish us all. Mrs. Cross has testified that he threatened to take certain papers to the authorities if he was cut out of the arrangement. That threat made murder immediate." Ben's face had gone pale, but not with innocence. Innocence usually protests first and blanches second. Guilt often reverses the order. Kramer turned to him. "You told nobody about that quarrel," Ben said. "I didn't think." "No," Wolfe said. "You thought constantly. That was your trouble." He folded his hands. Ben Harrow was not the original organizer that required age, access to the house, and practical use of the boathouse. Owen Pike served the river end. Daniel Cross managed the accounting end. But Ben Harrow discovered the operation, entered it, and eventually saw in it what Cross saw: leverage. He knew the papers could destroy reputations and perhaps ownership claims reaching back years. He knew Cross had become unstable, greedy, and explicit. He also knew there was to be one final transfer. Owen Pike growled. "That's talk." "Yes," Wolfe said. "Unlike your lies, it has structure." He turned back to Ben. On the morning of the murder, Cross had purchased waterproof cylinders. He intended to take possession of the papers himself, perhaps keep samples, perhaps approach authorities, perhaps blackmail his associates. At the boathouse, he confronted the person who could least afford exposure. That person struck him. Ben stood up. Number Kramer barked. "Sit down." Ben sat. Wolfe's voice stayed level. Cross seized the skiff as it was being cast off or secured. The splinter in his hand matched its fresh black paint. He was struck once at the temple and fell into the reeds. The killer then trusted confusion to divide suspicion between rivermen and household fears, but the quarrel destroyed that hope. Cross had named the true danger already. Not prison, not the police in general, but exposure within the circle itself. Ben's mouth worked. "You can't prove I struck him." Wolfe nodded. "Not from this chair. But Kramer can improve his evening. Search Harrow's room. Search his effects for copied papers, for notes matching Cross's codes, and for any document removed from the chest and withheld during the final quarrel. Also inquire into his debts. Young men with appetites and no income often develop criminal versatility." Kramer was already on his feet. Ben said, "Cross would have ruined all of us." There it was. No one spoke for a full second. Clara closed her eyes. Mrs. Rudd turned her head and looked at her nephew, as if she had never seen him before and disliked the correction. Wolfe said quietly, "Yes. That is why you killed sooner than a man fearing prison would have. Prison is remote. Exposure is immediate. It begins before arrest in the eyes of family." Kramer moved to Ben Harrow and took his arm. Ben did not resist, which is common once the right sentence has escaped the wrong mouth. As Kramer led him out, Wolfe looked at the cedar chest and said, mostly to himself, "Age discourages curiosity. It also encourages repetition. Criminals become sentimental about successful arrangements." I wrote that down because it sounded like Wolfe, and because the chapter deserved to end with the net drawn tight. The chest in the middle of the room, the river route explained. Daniel Cross exposed, as the man who tried to bargain with the traffic, and Ben Harrow revealed, as the one who feared exposure more urgently than prison. The last chapter, I knew, would be for the rest of it. How the circle began, who else shared guilt, and what exactly had been passing from water to house beneath the smell of cedar. Chapter 10. Damp metal tells the truth. Ben Harrow broke in the old-fashioned way, which is to say not all at once and not with dignity. First, it showed in his face where the strained cleverness gave way and left only youth, fear, and the sick look of a man who has just discovered that his private arrangements have become public furniture. Then it showed in his mouth, which had spent 2 days selecting words and now lost the habit. Kramer had him in the front room of the brownstone with one hand on his shoulder and the other resting where official patience turns into procedure. Clara sat very still. Mrs. Rudd had not moved since Ben's outcry. Owen Pike had shifted once toward the door and then thought better of it when he saw me watching. Wolfe remained in his chair, enormous, composed, and about as sympathetic as a tax law. Ben said, "I didn't mean to kill him." Kramer snapped. "You admit you hit him." Ben swallowed. "He came at me. He had hold of the skiff. He said he would take the packet and let the whole thing burn if I tried to stop him." Wolfe said, "Begging earlier. You are not yet entitled to the dramatic moment." That was Wolfe too. He would not let even a confession choose its own stage directions. Ben closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to the room instead of to any one face. That is what people do when shame needs an audience, but cannot bear a witness. "It began before Daniel," he said. "Long before. I only came into it later." Owen Pike said harshly, "Keep your mouth shut." Kramer wheeled. "You too." Ben laughed once, a dry, miserable scrap of sound. "Too late for that." Wolfe said, "Indeed." Ben took a breath. The papers came upriver in packets. Deeds, transfer records, mortgage releases, title abstracts, warehouse, filings, copies and originals. Whatever was useful. Some were stolen, some altered, some created out of half-truth and old signatures. They were used by men upriver working land and warehouse frauds, old properties with uncertain title parcels, where records could be shifted, claims inserted, liens erased, ownership rearranged before anyone sober knew what had happened. Clara stared at him. My God, he flinched but went on. The house was useful because no one looked at it. No officer would think to search a widow's bedroom for fresh contraband. The boathouse took the packets at night. The chest held them till morning, then they passed out with ordinary papers or through ordinary offices. Kramer said. Who organized it? Ben's eyes moved, unwillingly, toward Owen Pike. That was enough for Kramer, but not for Wolfe. Not alone, Wolfe said. Pike has practical knowledge, access to the water, and the habits of concealment. He does not have the invention for document traffic. Name the others. Ben wet his lips. There were men upriver. I don't know all the real names. Cross knew more than I did. He handled the receiving lists and the onward placements. Pike handled the water end and some of the timing. I helped with copying, sometimes with substitutions, sometimes with keeping track of what had gone where, because you needed money, Wolfe said. Ben looked at him with a sudden flash of anger. Yes, debts. Yes. Gaming. A pause. Some. Woman. Another pause. Some. Wolfe grunted. So the eternal engines continue. Mrs. Rudd finally spoke. Her voice was low and dry. How long? Ben would not look at her. Months, more than a year. In pieces, not always through the house, but often. And my husband knew. That question changed the room. Even Kramer turned slightly. Ben said, I think he knew something. Not the whole of it, maybe. Enough to hide papers, enough to stop looking too closely. I don't know. Wolfe said, Rudd's father, Ezra Vale, had used the chest before for concealed maritime papers. That precedent made the furniture available to later criminals. It does not prove Rudd's full complicity. Continue. Ben's hands had begun to shake now, not theatrically, but because the body, once relieved of lying, often takes up trembling as a secondary profession. Daniel became greedy, he said. At first he was careful. He liked the codes, the schedules, the importance of it. Then he realized what some of the documents were worth. Not the paper itself, but what could be claimed with them. He began holding things back, notes, copies, references. He wanted a larger share. Clara shut her eyes. Ben went on quickly, as if speed might reduce guilt. He said he had taken all the risk and deserved more. He said if he was denied again, he would keep the next packet or take samples to the law. He said there would be one last run and then he would stop being cheated. That was the quarrel, I said. Yes. Ben looked at me. You heard about it. I listen for a living. He nodded once miserably. The packet due that morning mattered. It contained not just transfer papers, but a ledger key, cross, references, initials expanded. Enough to connect the inland names with the river deliveries. Daniel had found out. He bought the waterproof tubes because he meant to carry the packet himself and hold it. Wolfe's eyes rested on him. And if prevented, he said he would go straight to the authorities. Kramer said, Which authorities? Ben made a helpless gesture. Any all, he said, district attorney 1 minute, federal men the next. It didn't matter. If he had those papers, it was enough. And so, Wolfe said, you met him at the boathouse. Ben's mouth tightened. Yes. How? Owen had brought the skiff in. The packet was aboard. Daniel was already there. He had one of the cylinders and demanded the rest. He said the route was finished, that he would decide what was paid and what was exposed. He grabbed the skiff when I told him he was mad. Owen Pike burst out. You stupid little rat. Kramer barked. Quiet. Wolfe, without raising his voice, said, Mr. Pike, if you interrupt again, I shall recommend that Kramer begin with you, rather than finish with you. That silenced him. Ben looked briefly grateful. which was absurd but human. He had hold of the gunwale, Ben said. He was pulling it in. We struggled. I took up the mooring bar. I don't even remember doing it. Not until after, I struck him once. He let go. A piece of paint and wood came off in his hand. He fell sideways into the reeds. Clara made a small sound. Barely a sound at all, Mrs. Rudd did not make any. And then, Kramer demanded, I thought. Ben stopped, swallowed, tried again. I thought if it looked like a river theft or some quarrel with outside men, there might be confusion. I left his keys and money because robbery is clumsy on the river. Men are struck, searched badly, thrown aside. I thought it might serve. It didn't, I said. Number. He looked at the cedar chest. Nothing served, Wolfe said, because you misjudged the intelligence of metal. That reached no one but me and perhaps Kramer. But Wolfe was entitled to one flourish, Kramer said. The packet, where is it? Ben's eyes shifted again toward Owen Pike. He moved it. Kramer moved so fast for a man his size that it almost looked graceful. Pike. Owen stood his ground for 1 second, then another, which was one too many. 2 detectives who had been waiting in the hall stepped in at Kramer's signal. It ended with no heroic resistance, only hard breathing and a curse. When the room settled again, Wolfe spoke as if resuming a lecture after a student's impolite interruption. This case began with reports of wet brass hinges. Mrs. Rudd thought of leaks, weather, and perhaps ghosts. There were none. The room was dry. Therefore the moisture was local, repeated, and purposeful. Mr. Goodwin smelled salt water, which eliminated fantasy. The false bottom in the chest established hidden storage, protected against damp. Cross's notes established a pattern of river deliveries. The skiff, the waterproof cylinders, and the splinter established the final quarrel. Everything else, denial, grief, invention, omission, was merely human upholstery. Mrs. Rudd looked at him with exhausted hatred and gratitude mixed so evenly that neither had room to dominate. You speak of it as if it was simple. It is simple now, Wolfe said. It was not simple when you concealed facts. That was severe, but not unjust. Clara rose then, slowly. Did Daniel ever intend to stop? Wolfe regarded her. Yes. She stared. You believe that? I believe, he said, that he intended to stop after profiting one final time. That is not reform, it is arithmetic. That was the last honest thing anyone said for a minute. Kramer took Ben Harrow and Owen Pike away with the efficiency of a man who had been annoyed long enough, and now meant to cash the annoyance in proper coin. The front room emptied by degrees. Clara went first, because grief had finally reached the stage where movement is preferable to endurance. Mrs. Rudd stood by the cedar chest a moment without touching it. My husband's father used it first, she said. Yes, Wolfe replied. And then the rest of us went on using what we preferred not to understand. Yes. She looked at the brass hinges. Now dry under the lamps. I thought the dampness meant the past was returning. Wolfe closed his eyes. Madam, the past rarely returns, it continues. After she had gone, I moved the chest aside because Fritz dislikes evidence in the front room, and because there are limits even to Wolfe's tolerance for symbolism after 7 o'clock. Wolfe remained in his chair, hands on the arms, eyes shut. Well, I said. Well, what? He asked. That was neat. It was adequate. Denial, grief, invention, and upholstery, you missed one. What? Archie Goodwin. He opened one eye. You are not upholstery. At best, you are movable equipment. I accepted that because in Wolfe's language it nearly counts as praise. As I straightened the chairs, I looked once more at the chest. It was only cedar, brass, and old workmanship, but it had held a family's convenient blindness, a dead man's leverage, a ring of document fraud, and the whole solution from the beginning. Not in the hidden compartment, in the hinges. Conversation had produced what conversation usually does. Denial from the guilty, grief from the decent, invention from the frightened, and fragments from everyone. But damp metal had told the truth at once. Salt water on brass in a dry room meant river hands before dawn. Once that was seen, the rest had merely taken time. At dinner, Wolfe praised the duck, condemned the potatoes, and said nothing more about murder. That was proper. A case solved is a case buried in that house, no matter how recently the police may still be walking about with it. As for me, I wrote up my notes later in the office and looked at one line before closing the book. A thing damp at sunrise has usually had company in darkness. Wolfe had said that in the beginning, and as often happens with him, the answer had arrived early and only waited for the rest of us to deserve it.